It's a dangerous time to say anything complimentary about Electronic Arts. Following the disastrous launch of Star Wars Battlefront 2, the now decades-long service known as microtransactions has come under public scrutiny, causing international governments and gambling regulatory organizations to begin their investigation into loot boxes. Likewise, Mass Effect, possibly the most celebrated series of last generation, came to an unceremonious end when its subpar sequel Andromeda disappointed fans and retailers alike, resulting in the shelving of the entire franchise. And of course, there was the all-too-familiar pattern of a beloved developer being abruptly shut down when Visceral Games closed its doors after 19 years. Yes, now is probably a bad time to highlight the positive contributions of EA, or at least a neutral perspective, but Electronic Arts is first and foremost a publicly traded business who just so happens to work in entertainment, no different than a television or movie production company, and as such, they generally push towards the most marketable and profitable ventures. But working in the creative industries means taking risks and funding unconventional ideas, not simply chasing the most popular developers of today, but also anticipating the next big thing. And it's likely this line of thinking that brought the oddball director Suda51 to EA Games in the late 2000s. A genuine visionary of the industry, few directors can match the disruptive styles of Goichi Suda. Beginning his career with Human Entertainment in the early 90s, he quickly attracted attention for his writing on the Fire Pro Wrestling series, introducing taboo topics such as depression and suicide into the traditionally upbeat genre. After a string of successful adventure games, Suda left Human to found his own studio, Grasshopper Manufacture, and it's here where his signature punk style would break through, starting with The Silver Case, an utterly bizarre visual novel police drama released on the PlayStation in 1999. But his North American debut wouldn't come until 2005, when Capcom published the classic PlayStation 2 and GameCube title Killer7, a dreamlike hodgepodge of adventure game, cursor shooter, and psychological horror. It was immediately recognized as one of the most original games of the generation, and retains a passionate cult following to this day. But sadly, it failed to meet sales expectations. Still, the project allowed Suda to collaborate with the revered director of Resident Evil, Shinji Mikami. The two became fast friends and began discussing future concepts they could work on together. And while they would professionally go their separate ways, Suda continued to sketch and flesh out ideas, alongside his 2008 Wii release, No More Heroes, the blood-soaked story of an otaku with a lightsaber attempting to become the world's #1 assassin. Despite positive reviews, it too was a sales disappointment, but after pushing 500,000 copies, it sold well enough to warrant a sequel, which would include a few musical tracks by Silent Hill composer Akira Yamaoka. A long admirer of Yamaoka's work, Suda expressed interest in directing a game similar to Silent Hill, tentatively titled Kuriyami. According to Suda's outline, players would control a nude man armed only with a torch as he explored the darkened streets of a nearby village and an elaborate castle. The enemies wouldn't be traditional monsters, but in a Kafka-esque turn, the villagers themselves would become warped from fear. Little else is known about the project, but in an interview, Suda hinted the visuals would be cel-shaded to create manga-like shadows. However, even Suda recognized his ideas were well outside the norm, even for him, and so Kuriyami was eventually abandoned. That is, until Mikami and Suda booked a meeting with Electronic Arts. After a string of unsuccessful pitches with Japanese publishers, the duo presented EA with two ideas, one of them being the revamped version of Kuriyami, later to be called Shadows of the Damned. EA loved it, and in August of 2008, Grasshopper formally announced their new publisher. But this, unfortunately, is where things get a bit hazy. In a number of interviews with Mikami, Suda, and Yamaoka, each mentioned how the game retained many of the disturbing elements of Kuriyami, but development eventually stalled. Between Grasshopper's growth as a company, Suda's responsibilities as the CEO, and Mikami's own work on 2010's Vanquish, Shadows of the Damned had dangerously become a game without a direction. To salvage the project, the team would need to start over from scratch and find a new leader. Enter Massimo Guarini, an Italian-born game designer who joined Ubisoft Milan in 1999. Over the course of the next several years, Guarini would oversee the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance versions of Ubisoft properties. Showing potential, he was promoted to larger productions of the Tom Clancy series, before moving to Montreal to work on the award-winning Naruto Rise of the Ninja. But Guarini's heart simply wasn't in AAA games. He longed to return to the smaller teams of handheld development, and so, moving once again, he left Canada for Japan to become a producer, jumping from disparate projects such as Happy Party with Hello Kitty and Friends and the somber Nintendo DS first-person shooter Moon. That was until a chance interview with Goichi Suda. Impressed by his unique vision, Guarini joined Grasshopper to direct the newest version of Shadows of the Damned. With a new director, a move to Unreal Engine 3, and the backing of EA, the project was finally back on track. And so the team went to work, crafting one of the most original, gruesome, and surreal action games ever produced. But its biggest departure from Kuriyami is its omnipresent sense of humor and grindhouse aesthetics. For starters, the protagonist is named Garcia Hotspur, named after Henry Percy and the Shakespearean character he was based on, though more frequently, he refers to himself as Garcia fucking Hotspur, a demon hunter who, well, Actually, that's all you really learn about him. After years of vanquishing Hellspawn, the ruler of the underworld himself, Fleming What's-His-Face, yes, that's really his name, challenges Garcia to a fight in the City of the Damned. And to encourage his participation, Fleming drags Garcia's girlfriend down to hell. Not exactly the most original story. In fact, Massimo Guarini has said he enjoys cliches because they help the audience better understand, and the deciding factor is how you challenge them. And in many ways, Shadow completely fit in line with the expectations of a third-person shooter in 2011, but it's the clever visual and objective tweaks that elevate it above its peers. The best example of this is Garcia's trusty demonic sidekick Johnson, who serves as a torch during exploration and transforms into a variety of guns with the pull of the left trigger. But he's also a strong personality with knowledge of the underworld, able to fill in the details and logic of the player's surroundings. It's a really smart way to streamline the popular mechanics of flashlights, weapons, and radio conversations into a single character, allowing the audience to enjoy the offbeat banter and giving the feel of a buddy adventure road movie. And while the journey is brief, only clocking in around 9 hours, the trek through the underworld is memorable with a psychedelic blend of mundane locations and unsettling occult imagery. According to Suda, this was an intentional direction, explaining he wanted hell to almost feel like the real world, as if it could be right behind our very own doors. Although in the case of Shadows of the Damned, those doors are locked behind baby heads who hunger for brains and strawberries, obviously, which will usually lead to rooms and streets full of vengeful demons. This is where Shinji Mikami's expertise comes into play. Though only listed as a producer, Guarini's new direction clearly borrowed heavily from Mikami's landmark 2005 title, Resident Evil 4. The most apparent similarities are the over-the-shoulder perspective and the use of unarmed enemies, which is canonically explained away by Hell's gun control laws. Less obvious are the stiff aiming controls, which can be frustrating early on, though it feels like a decisive creative choice, forcing players to stay in constant movement and building tension as the lumbering creatures close in, though this is slightly undercut as the pistols, shotguns, and machine guns progressively power up through purchased and unlockable upgrades, and direct combat scenarios are generally replaced by a set of moving obstacles centered around unlit environments. Another of Kuriyami's surviving concepts, the battle between light and dark plays a major role in Shadow's objective design. Even Johnson's illuminating flame is ill-equipped to handle the sudden flood of flesh-eating darkness, with Garcia's only salvation coming from shooting a goat with his signature light shot. Obviously, as quirky as that may sound, early visualizations of Satan frequently showed him to have a goat-like appearance, which was originally taken from the Greek god Pan. Anyway, the light and dark mechanics add a welcome puzzle-like wrinkle, with some enemies' vulnerabilities becoming exposed following a light shot, and hidden switches which can only be unlocked by venturing into the darkness. But it's when these systems collide together in quick succession that Shadows of the Damned is at its best. Bursting back the darkness and blasting skulls is a disorienting thrill, and yet the scenarios remain legible within the fluctuating chaos, which is all set to Yamoka's fantastic soundtrack, filled with pacing drums and primal screams. It's just too bad the boss battles aren't nearly as inspired, mostly consisting of bigger enemies with larger attacks that Garcia can easily avoid, before hitting them with a light shot to reveal their vulnerabilities. It's virtually the same as the standard gameplay, but more predictable, reserved, and plotting. As strange as it may sound, the worst aspects of the game come from trying too hard. Most of the basic gameplay and world building feels effortlessly weird, but when it comes to sexuality and the portrayals of Paula, the delivery falls flat. Already relying on the played-out trope of the damsel in distress, Shadows attempts to add some originality by continuously murdering Paula over and over again, or having her chase Garcia down in a murderous rage while wearing lingerie. And none of this works because she's a nothing character without a personality or purpose. If anything, she feels like a prop. And I know, some might say this is a deliberate choice to inspire curiosity of her character, or challenge the trope of trophy women being docile, but that's probably putting more thought into it than Grasshopper did. Not to mention, this is a game that gives an entire backstory to a reoccurring pooping monster, and multiple lengthy short stories to the rest of the cast. And then there's the near constant phallic innuendo, which to be honest is actually pretty great, as Garcia and the aptly named Johnson push back the vicious creatures with the game's main pistol, the boner. Childish? Sure, but it fits the game's cinematic comedy influences like The Evil Dead or Ghostbusters. But sadly, it too goes one step too far, when Johnson calls a sex hotline, becomes aroused, and becomes the big boner. Yes, it's still initially funny, but the following fixed camera wave-based sections are painfully slow, and simply not worth the joke, as well as a simplistic 2D shoot-'em-up section which goes on a bit too long. Now these frustrations aside, Shadows of the Damned delivered on the potential of punk horror. Guarini had successfully merged the bizarre logic of Suda51 and the gameplay styles of Shinji Mikami, and critics largely agreed, giving the game mostly positive reviews when it launched on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 on June 21st, 2011. But it wouldn't be long before the word got out. Following an extensive online marketing campaign, Shadows of the Damned was a commercial bomb. selling only 24,000 units in its debut month. Unsold copies would sit on store shelves before eventually being shipped off to discount chains like Big Lots, which is where I bought my copy. If that wasn't sad enough, Suda himself was allegedly unhappy with the end result, contrasting his overwhelmingly positive attitude in the press circuit. According to Mikame, Suda had planned and rewritten the game several times just to get it right, and the final version was nothing like he had planned. In an interview, Suda expressed regret, wishing he had added an online mode to compete with popular games of the time. While composer Akira Yamaoka expressed interest in returning to the property, Grasshopper and EA never worked together again. And less than a month after Shadow's release, Massimo Guarini left the company. And surprisingly, this is where the story has a happy ending. While Shadows of the Damned was a sales failure, nearly everyone involved went on to bigger and better things. Shinji Mikami started up his own studio, Tango Gameworks, which is now a subsidiary of Bethesda Software, and directed the popular survival horror game The Evil Within. In a similar direction, Massimo Guarini went on to found the developer Ovo Sonico, releasing the Vita exclusive Murasaki Baby in 2014 and the award-winning adventure game Last Day of June in 2017. As for Grasshopper Manufacture, things are looking up. Their high school zombie mashup Lollipop Chainsaw became their first title to sell over 1 million units, and shortly thereafter they were acquired by Gung Ho Online Entertainment, giving Suda's team, including the sound director Akira Yamaoka, a regular source of funding to finally create their first online game, Let It Die, a free-to-play roguelike where mostly nude players wander around a mysterious tower. Huh, that sounds familiar. And in recent news, Suda will finally return to the director's chair after a decades-long absence to direct the Nintendo Switch exclusive Travis Strikes Again, No More Heroes, with a tentative release date for later this year. Even Shadows of the Damned has been given a second life, as it's been added to the Xbox One backwards compatibility program. But what are the lessons of Shadows of the Damned? It seemed like a perfect antidote to the overly serious games of the day, and yet it was a commercial failure by any measurable standard. Some have blamed this on Electronic Arts interfering with Suda's creative vision, and while it might not have lived up to his original idea, everyone involved said EA was mostly hands-off and supportive. Unfortunately, the reasons for Shadows of the Damned sales disaster are still unclear, but its creative success is a good lesson for major developers. Grasshopper took a crack at a fairly well-worn genre and injected it with inviting yet gloomy visuals and a bizarre sense of humor, and it's because of this irregular direction that the few who played Shadows of the Damned still fondly recall it. Or as Massimo Guarini likes to say, it's not what you tell ultimately, but how you tell it.